Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody. This is Sean Nesbitt at Taylor Wessing, and you're listening to our webinar on the Modern Slavery Act, the story so far and the next chapters. I'm joined this afternoon in London time by Colin, Godfrey, and Roxane Bradley. I'll ask them both to say hello now. Hello.
Hi.
The second of those was Roxane. And we're going to talk with you over the next 40 or so minutes, depending on how many questions you have, about the UK's Modern Slavery Act, its effect and application on companies in the UK and around the world. And we're going to report on what the progress is so far in terms of who's complying, who's not complying, why and how. So we hope this will serve as a useful guide to current market practice and also help you identify future trends and things to build into your thinking as you start to do your first modern slavery statement or get ready to start preparing your second modern slavery statement. Now, I'm looking at the first slide on our overview, and I hope, which contains details of who's speaking when, and I hope that you can see that there is a question and answer box to the right of the slide. We will welcome questions that you raise as we're talking, and if there's a gathering point and people are pausing for breath or a drink of water or coughing, in my case, I will take the chance to look at what you've asked us and to raise it with Colin or Roxane as we go along. As you listen to this and come to the end, if there's anything that you feel is unclear or you'd like to hear more about, we'll have a look at that and we'll try and identify some common threads to questions and mop up things you want to talk about at the end as well. So do ask as we go along. Okay, so now I'm on to our third slide, which has got my introductory headline and a quirky reference to a report from the news press last week in the UK about our Prime Minister Theresa May, where she was interviewed about her own personal political position and what is important to her, and she was asked about her proudest achievement in politics. As you can see there, she says it's the Modern Slavery Act. She did it as Home Secretary, and she's continuing to work on modern slavery as an important issue for her, not as just domestic policy, but internationally. So for all that she's one of the few women Prime Ministers to have been appointed in the UK, only the second in the UK, for all that she's dealing with matters like Brexit and the UK's exit from the European Union and building a relationship with the new Prime Minister in the USA, the proudest achievement and the one that's most important to her is the Modern Slavery Act. We want to illustrate why that is, not just from a question of personal morality, beliefs and ethics, but also insofar as it relates to the UK's position internationally and as a business centre of excellence and as a place where people are to invest and to trade in the future. So let me now pass over to Roxane to illustrate the current mood and the degree of interest in the media and across the business community in modern slavery.
Hi everyone, I'm now on slide 4, so modern slavery. Over recent months we've seen it receive an increased press interest. It's a very current topic, it can be quite scandalous, and as a result it can be very damaging to brands. So what we've seen is the press really focusing in on it. So if I now just take you through some of these headlines, the first one, child refugees in Turkey making clothes for UK shops. This was reported by the BBC in October of last year, and it centres on a panorama investigation around Syrian refugee children working on clothes for well-known brands such as M&S and ASOS, and also Zara and Mango. Interestingly, in this story, all brands were careful to say that they very carefully monitor their supply chain and don't tolerate the exploitation of refugees or children, but nonetheless, this was what made the headline in that instance. The second headline there is child labourers linked to Colgate toothpaste and Dove soap. This was in November, and as reported by The Times, it was in relation to an investigation undertaken by Amnesty International. Children were working in dangerous conditions in Indonesia for very well-known brands such as Unilever, Reckitt Benckiser, Kellogg, Colgate-Palmolive, Procter & Gamble and Nestlé. Moving on to slide 5 now. We have got gangmasters agreed to pay more than £1 million to settle modern slavery claims. This was reported in The Guardian just before Christmas and is in relation to a Kent-based couple who agreed a large settlement for a group of migrants who were trafficked to work on farms producing eggs for high street brands. And this was in relation to the Happy Eggs brand, which you might be familiar with. It's sold in various supermarkets. What was noticeable here was that it was the first settlement of a claim against a British company in relation to modern slavery, and now there are 10 other claimants who are expecting to bring similar cases. This also links into a recent Channel 4 documentary you might have seen on modern slavery in the UK, and that was in relation to labourers also. Second one on that slide, 97 Albar workers arrested in a crackdown on barbaric modern slavery. That was part of a cross-government drive to clamp down on illegal working. On the next slide now, on page 6. Brothers jailed for slavery over workers they recruited for Sports Direct. This was reported by the Metro in January and refers to people who are being trafficked from Poland and being sent to work at a warehouse in Derbyshire. This is another example of Sports Direct receiving negative press again. You might remember that they were initially subjected to criticism in relation to zero-hours contracts. This suggests that high-profile companies are being looked at across the board and really being scrutinised and put under the microscope.
And so just jumping in there, what I want to highlight is that the examples Roxane has given are all examples of commercial businesses, many of them listed and leading UK and international companies, which are being looked at for their procurement and how they source and resource the labour, whether it's directly or through third-party contractors. And it applies to acts which are occurring in the UK, as well as to supply chain and provisions which are occurring around the world. There's a very strong interest here in the influence of business and in the consumer in dictating how business behaves. And we're really focusing on these as commercial issues in the UK, and not so much in the way that Ashton Kutcher and the US congressional hearings were focused last week on sexual slavery, child exploitation, and exploitation of women from around the world. This is very much about business and commercial practice for its own sake, and also as an indicator of other kinds of good governance and good behaviour. There's almost a theory here that, a bit like the broken window theory in New York City in the 1980s, if there's a broken window, then there might be other forms of antisocial or other activity that can exist or prosper. So there's a sense that across the board, these are indicators of a sound, sustainable, investable and valuable business, which is increasingly under the microscope, a topic which is increasingly to the forefront as people look at good corporate behaviour more widely in society.
Okay, so I'm just going to now take us through a few slides giving some detail, firstly about the requirements for compliance with the Modern Slavery Act, a bit of a recap for us, and then we're going to go through some of the most recent and relevant statistics that have come out in relation to compliance and in relation to the industries and sectors where we've started to see some patterns arise. So just looking at this next slide, what we've got here is a bit of a recap on who actually needs to produce a statement under the terms of the Modern Slavery Act. So the test here, as you'll see, is fourfold. So we need to have a commercial organisation, an organisation which is carrying on its business or any part of its business in the UK. And it's that latter part which is really important here, that this is a very truly global piece of legislation. So it doesn't matter where an organisation is based, whether it's based in the UK or elsewhere in the world. If it's doing any part of its business in the UK, then it is likely to be caught as long as the other requirements are satisfied. So the organisation also needs to supply goods and or services, and also the main area where perhaps a lot of companies will drop off in terms of the need for compliance is that there must be a global turnover of at least 36 million or more. And it's important to mention there that that global turnover is the turnover of the company and all of its subsidiaries. So it's not just the one organisation which is carrying out or has a particular footprint in the UK. It is any of that organisation's subsidiary companies that will also be amalgamated for the purpose of calculating the minimum requirement.
And just to jump in there, we've had a question about the relationship above that company to parents, especially parents from the US or other overseas companies. When we come on to Roxane's piece a little bit later on, we'll discuss what happens in terms of going above. And Colin's also going to discuss the best options for putting a modern slavery statement on your group website or individual subsidiary websites.
Absolutely. And what you'll see there on the slide is a couple of links, firstly to our overview of the Modern Slavery Act. So for some further information, please do take the time after this webinar to click on the link. If you haven't got the link to hand, it also can be found on www.taylorwessing.com/modern-slavery-act. There's also a link there to our assessment tool. So this is our attempt to make life a little bit easier for people to work out whether or not they need to comply with the requirements of the Act. It's a quick, easy and a free assessment tool. So it will help organisations to decide both whether or not they're caught by the requirements of the Act, so those 4 things on the slide there, but also it will provide an organisation with an indication of the risk that exists within the supply chain based on the types of industries in which an organisation is working within, and also the geographies in which the industry is based, but also receiving supplies from. Moving on then to our experience of the actual response rates so far as we've seen. As Roxane has quite rightly pointed out, this is big news. It is very high on the press agenda. It's receiving a significant profile. So is all of the clamour around this actually reflected in the production of statements? Well, it's generally accepted that around about 17,000 organisations worldwide will actually need to produce a statement. So we are now around 6 months on from the first compliance deadline, and how are we doing? Well, in a world of fake news and alternative facts, it depends on who you believe. There is no one organisation that is responsible for collating statements. The UK government on this occasion has preferred to allow a variety of organisations to report on response rates and to accumulate the figures from across the board. In our experience, there are 2 principal organisations who have been seeking to chronicle all of the Modern Slavery Act statements that have been coming out over the course of the last few months. Those are an organisation called TISC Report, which stands for the Transparency in Supply Chains Report. A link to their website is on the slide. And the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, again, a link to their website on the slide. Now, our assessment of the TISC Report figures is that they're currently reporting that there are over 18,000 statements in existence at the moment. So does that mean we're all done? Can we all rest easy that everybody's done what they need to do? Well, contrast that with the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre data, and you've got a very different picture. They report that there's actually closer to 1,500 statements in existence, which is less than 9% of the total number who actually need to comply. So trying to get to the bottom of this quite significant discrepancy, we've actually spoken with TISC Report, and they've been very keen to emphasise that the information on their website is effectively raw data. So they've got 18,000 there, but it includes duplicates from group companies, so where you've got very large companies who have a number of subsidiaries, that can run into the teams. They will have essentially many statements listed on the website, even though effectively it's just one company. And also, it includes statements from companies who aren't actually caught by the requirements of the Act, but who have elected voluntarily to produce a statement. It's equally clear from our analysis of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre that that's not actually a complete list, and that it's too reliant on manual searching from people trying to add statements to the list. So the answer, well, in our view, it's somewhere between the two. I believe it's likely that the actual figure is somewhere between 20 to 30%. So I would estimate that we're still quite a long way off even remotely being at full compliance. But it's worth noting as well that TISC Report is actually working with the UK Home Office to analyse its data, and there is an expectation that in March of this year there will be a much more accurate assessment of exactly how many people have complied. So watch this space and we will obviously update you. Moving on then to looking a little bit deeper at the figures. If we look at some of the assessments by industry, what you'll see is that this throws up some interesting trends. The biggest take-up by industry appears to be within the professional services and scientific and technical sector. Now, that might well be indicative of a greater awareness in those areas. It might be that statements in those areas are simply simpler because they are, generally speaking, lower risk, but it's also perhaps an indication that nobody in professional services wants to be caught out by their own administrations. The figures also do suggest that manufacturing, as well as wholesale and retail, are taking this really seriously, and that's probably reflective of what Roxane has explained so far, of these headlines that you've got a lot of high street brands who clearly see that this has a particular impact on them. Then, if you look a little bit further down the list, you'll see that take-up has been much slower in other areas, such as agriculture, forestry, fishing, right at the bottom there. And it's ironic that perhaps some of those industries, not all of them, but some of those, are operating within sectors which are perhaps at higher risk of incidents of modern slavery. Fishing, for example, is an area where there is well-reported and documented issues, particularly in relation to fishing in Thailand, where there are, as of just last year, a report that slavery and trafficking is still pervading this sort of area, in spite of the well-publicised efforts to crack down. Also areas such as fruit picking, even in the UK, where it's dominated by casual workers, there is an influence of unlicensed gangmasters, which means that this is an area where businesses have, in the past, exploited those desperate for work. Again, inconsistent perhaps with the numbers that we're actually seeing with the publication of statements. But do bear in mind that some of these sectors, perhaps further down the list, are dominated by a small number of large companies, thinking maybe about mining and quarrying, where there may be some very large companies who dominate the sector. So some of this may be an indication of there being fewer organisations within those sectors who actually need to comply.
And just jumping in there, because this is prompted by a question, but also Colin's remark on the prevalence of professional services and, let me say, city or financial institutions who are complying. The questions come in, what happens if a company simply doesn't produce a modern slavery statement? Are there any potential fines or punishment? And that's a really good question, because the answer is no. And intuitively that can tell you on its own, perhaps, about the rate of compliance and why many organisations have not yet got their act together. There is no criminal sanction, and there is no direct financial penalty. It doesn't yet render a business ineligible for public contracting or other forms of state-operated enforcement. The policy is being enforced essentially through a media, brand, reputational governance angle, where our government is inviting consumers, shareholders, pension funds which invest, voters even, to consider what their attitude is, and is, in a sense, leaving it to the market to regulate itself in terms of judging what your best approach is and how much you should care. And we would never say to our clients or our counterparties, well, you've got to comply with the law just because it's the law. Like any business, you need to make a decision based on your priorities and what is best for your marketplace. Naturally, we do and should support the law, but you've got to think about the cost of trade to complying and not complying. And I hazard that professional practices and investors, for example, are more likely to early adopt on this, because modern slavery is just one of the indicators that can be used, a bit like my broken streetlight analogy, to establish whether a business has good governance generally. Roxane referred to Sports Direct, which has been under continued attack for something like 18 months now over a number of governance practices. And it can be taken that the more of these things you chalk up, the more your risk management and your safety as an investment might be called into question. So this is just one of the signs that is being taken, and I think that because it's an important sign that professionals are adopting it early. We've had a number of fund managers, those might be PE funds or venture capital funds, for example, which don't really have much of a supply chain themselves, but they are feeling that they have to instigate Modern Slavery Act transparency and policy compliance on their investments, because it's a sign of them being good guardians of investors' money, and a sign that they are managing and regulating processes more widely. And of course, many pension funds, large insurers and so on are obligated to report to their people on the nature of their investment management. So this is a lot about customer, investor management and the protection and enhancement of brands at this stage. We anticipate that more strenuous enforcement measures may come in, and we'll talk a little bit later on about how the law is going to develop.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's certainly an aspect that awareness plays a huge part with all of this. And the next slide, as you'll see, is a demonstration of what I think is an indication of the awareness in these particular areas for why the number of people within the UK and USA complying with the requirements of the Act is so much higher than outside of those two countries. And it's quite clear that the UK and USA get it, and the reason for that is broadly because it's those two countries that have existing legislation in place in relation to this, and so awareness is inevitably going to be higher. In the UK, it's the Modern Slavery Act. In the States, there's the Californian Transparency and Supply Chains Act. So it's very much on their radar. The number of companies based in other countries publishing statements is, as you'll see, far lower, but that is most likely because, number one, there are less companies in those other regions who are in fact actually caught by the requirements of the Act, but also our experience is that awareness in those countries for the compliance of the Act and the expansive geographical scope of the Act is much lower.
And I'm going to hazard another reason why it might be slightly lower at this stage, which is that people may not understand what modern slavery actually is in our terms. I talked about Ashton Kutcher and the obvious feature of trafficking and abuse of children and women. But the UK has a definition of modern slavery, as we have been asked, that is much broader than those obvious things. And perhaps we ought to spell that out now so that people get where it fits in.
Absolutely. So the official definition of slavery for the purpose of this is slavery, servitude, or forced or compulsory labour and human trafficking. So typically the examples would be exacting work or service from somebody under the threat of a penalty, obliging somebody to provide their services through some form of coercion, and that can often include requiring them to live somewhere with the impossibility of actually getting out of their particular condition. Any suggestion of sort of ownership that somebody's been deprived of their freedom, and then in the context of human trafficking, the facilitation of the travel of somebody with the purpose of their exploitation. So that's really what the Act is looking at in terms of what slavery is and what it's trying to redress, at least.
So examples where we've seen it beyond, for example, the forced work of women from Southeast Asia in nail bars who are also forced to work in sexual services in the evening, would include people who are being shipped over from Eastern European EU countries to work in agricultural labour, or as Roxane mentioned earlier in the case of Sports Direct, I think that was 18 folk from Poland.
Yeah.
An established European Union country. I think the fact will have been that they will have paid or been lent money in order to make the move to the UK, and often you see people being required to give up their passports or travel documents, or required to live at high rent in accommodation, and being forced to consume services that make it hard for them ever to leave because they can't afford to pay back the people who have lent them the money. So it's not always as obvious as sexual violence and illegal migration. Poland, of course, is in the EU. People can migrate here legally, and yet there are still ways to leverage off the different living standards, educational standards, and economic opportunities to exploit people in the more wide sense that we use it here.
Absolutely. And just one other area where we thought it would be useful to have a look at some empirical data is actually through the Modern Slavery Act assessment tool that we've developed. Again, there's a link on the side to it. But what we have done is we've taken an indicative sample of around 50 responses, and our current findings suggest that there is a real desire from organisations to find out how this might affect them, and that nearly 40% of respondents actually aren't in fact caught by the Act. And that suggests to me that this is an indication that organisations may well have an inkling that it doesn't apply, but need some form of formal confirmation that they can take back perhaps to their board, to their directors, as to why they don't specifically need to produce a statement. But you'll also see that about a third of respondents so far appear to not only be caught by the Act, but are operating within a higher risk, either industry or geography. And so it's clear to me that there is engagement from organisations with perhaps more complex supply chains who understand that there is a need to actually manage and cope with the potential risk that receiving goods from particular industries and particular areas might present to them. Now obviously if you want to find out how your organisation features, then there's a link again on the slide. But one other point I wanted to mention is that through our work with clients, we have seen a number of common themes in terms of issues that have been coming out from statements being published in general. And one of the issues that we've been finding is that there is some difficulty, or there at least is some problem with people actually having statements signed off by the appropriate person. So there's a specific requirement under the Act for statements to be signed by a director of the organisation who is actually publishing the statement. And the data that we have suggests that about 1 in 4 statements isn't actually signed by an appropriate person. And one of the other problems that we've been seeing is that there are quite a lot of similarities between statements that have been produced. And it suggests that there's been a lot of copying and pasting going on, that organisations have been seeing others' statements and been using those as effectively a template to produce their own. And obviously in the context of the way in which we imagine this is going to be policed by NGOs looking for organisations who are not taking it seriously, that sort of cookie-cutter approach is clearly going to come off very poorly. The way we approach this is that whilst we do try to make the process as streamlined as possible, every single statement that we would produce is something that would be specifically tailored to the industry and to the specific steps that the organisation itself is taking to try to address the issues that it has within its supply chain.
So Colin, that goes to another question that's just popped up on our screen here at Taylor Wessing. The remark is that the Modern Slavery Act seems to contemplate that a statement will be filed similar to an annual report. And have we got any comment or feedback about how organisations that post static statements rather than annual statements? I think that's getting at two features really. One is physically and technologically, how do you post it? And I think a related question is where, which relates to group company structure. But the other one is the notion that it's not a one-time only report. And perhaps having identified what is going wrong at the moment, you might just want to identify that it's a continuing process.
Yes, absolutely. So almost going in reverse perhaps, this is absolutely an annual requirement. So the obligation is to produce statements within 6 months of the first year-end date that falls after the 31st of March 2016. And as Sean will come to later, that means there are some pretty big deadlines still to come. But this is not a one-off obligation, it is a recurring and ongoing obligation, and particularly noteworthy that there may well be organisations which are not even in existence now that will be in over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, who will then, as soon as they are required to comply with the Act, will need to produce their statements within the appropriate time frame. In terms of actually signing off statements, organisations are taking one of two different approaches. Either they are simply including a link to perhaps a PDF document online which has been signed, or alternatively they are simply having a separate web page which hosts the actual statement. But importantly with both, it still needs to be signed, albeit that you could utilise an electronic signature as long as it is from in the context of a corporate body, a director of that company. And in terms of where it goes, it needs to go on the website of the most appropriate organisation for the business carried out in the UK. So generally speaking, a group company that is based overseas but has operations in the UK and a website which is hosted, perhaps a .co.uk website hosted in the UK, would more likely post it on the latter rather than its parent website, which perhaps its UK operators wouldn't see immediately on searching online for it.
Again, though, that's really a feature of the brand and the industry that the business is in. If you look, there's some great statements, for example, Jaguar Land Rover, that's a business that's sourcing from around the world, that's selling around the world, that's very heavily regulated, that is preoccupied already with sustainability, recycling, and ecological issues. It's a business that's done a lot of work on its ethics and its corporate responsibility and responding to international governance standards. So a business like that might want to add in their modern slavery statement as part of their existing suite of sustainability and wider corporate reporting documentation, and make a virtue out of showcasing quite high in their window on their website how this piece fits in. For other businesses which aren't so regulated, aren't perhaps so heavily involved with long supply chains and international labour differences, then it might be appropriate to put it in the housekeeping, almost in the small print. You're still complying, but you give it the right profile according to what your risk is and what your market position is.
Absolutely. And so having looked through some of the data, what I'm now going to do is going to pass back over to Roxane, who's going to go through some of what we are seeing as the main motivators for clients to comply in this type of area.
And just on that, as you start, Roxane, I hope not to throw you off, but we've had a question which really goes to the who complies with what piece. Here's the question: we're a UK company with a US parent. Do we need to mention the entire US supply chain, or are the subsidiaries doing business in the UK enough? So perhaps you can deal with that as you go through your slide.
Yeah, sure. And I think this slide deals with that perfectly, actually. So I'm now looking at slide 12, case study 1, understanding who's caught in a group structure. So the 4 factors to be considered when determining who needs to comply with the requirement are fairly straightforward, as Colin took us through earlier. But working out who needs to comply in a group structure can be a little more time-consuming. So the example on the screen is of a group structure. So it's headquartered in the US with subsidiaries in Germany and in the UK. So the first limb of the test is met for all companies on this chart because they're all commercial organisations. We're told they're all companies. The second limb of the test is also met because we're also told that they all provide some type of service. So on the face of it, they're all caught at this stage. So now we need to look at each of these companies in turn for the third and fourth limb. So if we look at the US Topco first, its turnover is well over the £36 million threshold. So if it does business in the UK, it's caught. As Colin said earlier, you need to take a common sense approach to whether or not the company is doing business in the UK. If we assume it does do some business here, so for example it contracts with some clients in the UK, then it's caught and it needs to supply a statement. However, if it doesn't do anything in the UK, all business in the UK is done through the UK subsidiaries, which we'll go on to later, then it doesn't satisfy this final limb, it isn't caught, and it doesn't need to produce a statement. Moving on then to the UK subsidiary IT Security Limited. So it's a UK-based services company. We assume it does business in the UK. Also note that it and its subsidiary have a turnover of over £36 million. So it's caught by the requirement and it should produce a statement. Looking at its subsidiary on its own, IT Support Limited, it alone doesn't meet the turnover threshold and it has no subsidiaries. So it's not caught and it doesn't need to produce a statement. But to the extent that it forms part of the IT Security Limited supply chain, then IT Security Limited may need to refer to what IT Support Limited is doing in its own statement. Moving then over to the German subsidiary, that doesn't meet the turnover threshold and it has no subsidiaries, so it doesn't need to produce a statement. Moving then on to slide 13, case study number 2, motivations for compliance. So the case study is as set out on that screen. So we've got Shine Bright Limited, who manufactures and supplies wholesale cleaning products. We're told that Shine Bright supplies Fresh Foods, which is a large chain of UK supermarkets. So here, this kind of takes us back to the Gangmaster headline that we looked at earlier in relation to the Happy Egg supply chain, and supermarkets increasingly being encouraged to take an interest in where their goods are coming from. So we're told that Shine Bright's group global revenue is £25 million. For itself, it isn't caught by the need to produce a statement. However, it receives a questionnaire from Fresh Foods, including the following question. Have you taken any steps to eliminate acts of modern slavery from your organisation and supply chain? Do you have policies and procedures in place to hold your supply chain accountable for compliance with your standards on issues such as slavery and human trafficking? And do you have a defined approach for addressing any occurrences of non-compliance with your policies and procedures relating to slavery and human trafficking? So ultimately, this is an example of clients being under increasing pressure from their onward supply chain to show that what they're doing in relation to modern slavery, even if they themselves fall outside the scope of the Act and don't actually need to produce their own statement. The key message here is to be prepared and not wait to be asked to produce something, but to try and have something together already so that when you are asked these questions, you can act quite quickly. Specifically in relation to tendering and procurement, Modern Slavery Act compliance is likely to become a prerequisite. So even if you're not caught, it's important that you can easily speak to these issues and explain the measures that you're taking.
Just before we hand back over to Sean, we've had a question in relation to the signature of statement. The question being, when we say that an electronic signature is possible, whether or not that means a scan of a physical signature or just the name or position will suffice. Essentially, I think the key thing is that there is a requirement under the Act for it to be signed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the one that goes online has to physically have the signature attached to it. So as long as there is a signed version of the statement signed by a director, then I would say that simply having the name and or position on the online statement would be sufficient.
Now I'll pass back over to Sean, who's going to talk about where this issue might be taking us next.
Okay, thanks. So I'm looking at slide 15 now, and we've got a couple more to go. We've had a number of questions come in, which we've looked to deal with more or less real time, and they have generally fit very well with the shape and timing of what we're discussing. So do please, well, we've got the next, say, 5, maybe 10 minutes available. Keep asking questions. We'll probably finish just before quarter to 5. Now, where next? As Colin mentioned, statements are required to be posted online, and they don't have to be part of your annual accounts. And the period for compliance started for financial years ending 31 March 2016 onwards. So by the time we get to 31st March 2017, in about 5 weeks' time, we will be close to the point where some of you have to do your second statement. For others, the first statement will be due, will be 29 September 2017. And of course, different businesses have different year ends, but typically the majority for our clients are calendar year end, so December's. But often you've got March, April, May and June year ends as well. So look carefully and liaise with your general counsel or your corporate governance office, your company secretary, to check what your date is. Last possible date for compliance is the 29th of September. And we have an anti-slavery commissioner report which is issued each year. And those will start to increase the spotlight on people, as will the non-governmental organisations which are monitoring and who have got government funding to report and to spotlight the worst examples of non-compliance. There are other changes in the pipeline. There is legislation going through the UK Parliament which proposes to enhance the reporting obligation. We've said you only have to post it online on an appropriate website, but if this legislation is passed, as we expect it will be, there will be a requirement to include the anti-slavery statement in your annual financial reports where you're obliged to do that. So if you're a business that is already producing a remuneration committee report and reporting on other aspects of shareholder oversight, then there'll be a requirement to put the statement in your annual report and accounts. And of course, where many people have outsourced auditing and accounting, it can be a good reminder to liaise with your accountants just to see whether they can assist in the preparation of these statements. There's a number of websites that can help support their production if you don't want to lose hours. Keep an eye on the media and its focus on particular industries, whether those be in fashion and luxury goods, in retail especially. There are a number of bloggers, Livia Firth and various other people and organizations regularly blog, and you should keep a close eye according to your industry and market sector and what competitors are doing in terms of defending themselves or enhancing their brand reputation. Now, I've been asked while speaking, I love this question, it's impossible to get through any webinar without discussing Brexit. So here's our Brexit question. Given Brexit, would you think the UK will keep this kind of extraterritorial legislation, and might it further reduce the UK as an attractive business environment? So sort of two in one there. On the Brexit point, of course, our Prime Minister was not a supporter of Brexit, but she's committed to implementing it. And I think that this, the Act being so dear to her heart, is not going to go away, and its extraterritorial nature is not going to change now that she's responsible for international relations as much as homeland security and matters while she was Home Secretary. Think about Sports Direct and the example that Roxane gave at the start of this. Those workers were shipped across from Poland within the EU. Now, if you're a Prime Minister and a government dealing with a sizable part of the electorate that is concerned to exit the EU and to preserve the idea of jobs for local folk, and is probably the same constituency that has been keen to reduce inbound migration to the UK, then you can see how it may play to a political constituency to keep enforcing laws that make it less easy for migrant workers to come to the UK and to be exploited or abused by labour suppliers or other businesses, and to make it a matter of domestic economic health and benefit to the UK workforce to enforce these laws. Now, as to whether it makes the UK less attractive as a destination, I think it's important to look across at other jurisdictions. As Colin mentioned, the US has the Californian legislation, and of course that does apply to California-based entities, but it generates awareness and degrees of compliance around the United States of America. The Australian government is now looking at passing their own modern slavery legislation. I think that's partly influenced by Australia's proximity to some of the food, minerals and mining, natural resources production centres in Southeast Asia. It's probably also influenced by Australia's proximity to Japan, and Japan is a material inward investor into Australia. Japan has rules on corporate governance which require integrated reporting by listed entities in the Japanese stock market. And for the last couple of years, they've had an increasing focus on non-financial reporting around governance, ethics and oversight. If you think about some of the corporate scandals involving whistleblower treatment in electronics companies a couple of years ago, and in relations between non-official or non-compliant organizations and official and legally compliant business, Japan has really worked at driving up its investor returns and its governance, and probably it's a matter of the economic health of Australia that they identify that they need to keep step with the standards in other sophisticated economies. And in other jurisdictions, Burma, Thailand, other places, suppliers are having to comply and drive up their own performance if they are to continue dealing with UK consumer markets in food and other production. So I think a combination of regulatory oversight, government policy, and also attitudes of consumers to what they're willing to buy and spend their money on support means that it's unlikely the push goes away. If anything, the Modern Slavery Act, like a number of other transparency and reporting initiatives, are probably going to form an important plank of this government's future policy in terms of investor relations and building a healthy and sustainable economy to compete in Europe and around the world. Now, I think I've, in that long answer, got to the bottom of slide 15, and I'm coming on now to slide 16 in terms of conclusions and predictions. Perhaps while I do that, I'll just put out a sort of last cry for any other questions that people might want to raise while we're talking on air, and in doing that I'll buy myself time to look across at Colin and Roxane to see whether they might be a better place to answer a couple of these. So I'm just going to drop out 3 questions that I have here that we will look to answer, and we'll work out when we answer them in a second, but so that you know we're dealing with them. What do we do where the main company is in Europe and is doing business via a branch in the UK, not a legally separate subsidiary? So I'm going to ask Roxane to come back to that in a second. What do you do if you don't have a website? Dynamite question for Colin. And also, does each organisation within the group structure need to produce a statement, or can you produce one at the level of the top company or the highest holding company that is affected? So I think that's well, Colin and Roxane can toss a coin for the right to answer that question. So we'll come back to those 3. But while they're getting ready to answer those questions, I'm on slide 18 now on conclusions and predictions. And the central point that we're making here is that compliance is quite a dull and boring word and tends to lack life and meaning, but viewed through the lens of modern slavery, it's really a matter of risk and brand management in terms of enforcement action, but also informal soft control, soft retribution carried out by consumers, including consuming lobbying groups. Be mindful that there's potential for impact on international trade and also M&A stuff. If you think about the recent Kraft offer for Unilever, I think it's pretty likely that in a long debate about the merits of that sort of takeover, which of course is not going through, there would be discussion about the different approaches to sustainability, investment and resourcing. Unilever positions itself around the world as a sustainable stable of brands, very interested in ethics and so on. So be mindful of the potential for these sorts of issues to become higher up the agenda in reputational profile and even in M&A activity. And we would predict that there is a better business agenda in the UK and around the world coming out of the financial crisis of the last decade, where there are different aspects of governance, risk management and performance that go to help people add up a better sense of the total picture of a company's viability and investability. There are a bunch of things in the UK which go to transparency and empowering investors and consumers better to judge companies. So in the UK, as of this April 2017, we have laws on gender pay gap reporting where, a little bit like modern slavery, you have to publish information on your approach, in this case on the facts underlying your business, to disclose information on the pay gap between men and women, if you're a big enough business with 250 employees. There are other measures such as the transparency rules on late payments, where large corporates and firms must report on whether they pay their suppliers and smaller businesses that depend on them on time, and that has to be published on a government-controlled website rather than necessarily on your own website. There's an increased focus, of course, on tax transparency and compliance, and more widely there's the government's review on supply chain and modern employment practices, which might result in recommendations or requirements that businesses have to disclose if they use labour agencies and temporary workers. So there is seemingly an inevitable curve towards more disclosure, more transparency, whether you're a privately held or a public company. And so we would be suggesting that you don't just view modern slavery in isolation, but you take this as a chance to build a sustainable, cost-effective, pragmatic approach to disclosures that are going to be required in the future in other areas, and get used to having a process of evaluation, of understanding of audit and of description that works for you, is proportionate, that's not too much of a burden, but is tailored to your market and attitudes of investors, consumers and regulators. So treat this as the start of a process, not a one-off project, and be ready to evolve and adapt it, but build in the capacity to do that as you design your first responses. So with that said, I'm going to invite my colleagues here to respond to the 3 questions that I threw out a moment ago. Who wants to go first?
So if I jump in first, the question, what if you do if you don't have a website? It's a very good question. I should have covered that before. The position there is that it is a requirement to have a statement and to provide it to anybody who requests a copy within 30 days. So it doesn't need to go anywhere, be put anywhere specific. If you don't have a website, then it's simply a matter of making sure that if you receive a written request for one, then if it is in existence, then you need to provide it to that person within 30 days of the request. And I will hand back over to Roxane to cover the 2 questions about who needs to comply in the group structure.
So we've had a question in relation to case study 1, and the question is, what's the situation if the main company is in Europe and is doing business via a branch in the UK, not a subsidiary, as we had in our example? So if the EU company is doing business in the UK and so is the UK branch, and together they have a turnover of at least £36 million, then the EU company will need to do a statement covering the acts of both it and the UK branch. So they could do a joint statement if they are doing similar things. Then we have got the question, does each organisation within the organisation structure need to produce a statement, or just the top co in the structure? So this really goes back to the fact that it depends which company is a corp. So if you have got a group scenario and you've got several companies that are corp, they're all doing the same thing, then you could do a group statement. However, if you've got different companies that are corp and they're doing different things, then it might be better to separate out the statements so that you can be absolutely clear what steps each company is taking to the extent that they're different.
Okay, so thanks for joining in the way that you have done, and they're coming thick and fast, so I can keep knocking Colin and Roxane off their guard. Now, Colin, there's one for you. If you're a non-UK company but you're doing business in the UK, then this law applies to you. Could we just expand and elaborate on that? It's a little bit about branch structure, but it's also about how do you know that you're doing business in the UK?
Yes, absolutely. The guidance says to essentially take a common sense approach as to what is doing business in the UK. Generally speaking, an organisation that is selling goods to people in the UK is likely to have a sufficient footprint to have to comply. So selling goods to people in the UK, providing services to people in the UK is likely to be enough wherever you're based. Having a separate legal entity in the UK may well, in Roxane's example, take that company out of the requirement for, the parent company out of requirement for compliance if the two are genuinely separate legal entities and are not having anything to do with one another in terms of one supplying goods to the other. But the typical scenario we see is that a UK subsidiary of a foreign-based company is usually in receipt of some form of services or products from its parent, and that is likely to be a sufficient footprint in the UK to have to comply.
And Roxane, perhaps the last question, I think, for you.
We've got a final question here then. So does a UK organisation with an overseas parent produce the statement, or does the overseas parent produce the statement? So again, this goes back to the consideration of who it is that's caught, but assuming here we've got a UK organisation with an overseas parent, and they're both caught by the requirement, then it can be produced on behalf of both of them. So the parent can produce it and also explain what it is that the UK subsidiary is doing in relation to modern slavery.
And as a sort of slight company secretarial point on that, in that answer and that question, we're talking about two different companies. You can sort of double up to the highest level at which it's applicable, and that can be one size fits all. If you're dealing with a situation where it's an overseas company, but it's just got a branch in the UK, so it's not a different entity, it's not registered as a UK company, it's an informal offshoot, then remember that the statement always needs to be signed by a director of the company, which would mean a director in Germany or France or in Cyprus. So they are required, even if they're outside the country and outside the jurisdiction, to comply with the law, they would need to sign that statement. Okay, so I think we are coming up to 5 to 5 and probably time to wrap up. Just looking at slide 17 with some key points to take away. The most basic thing around compliance is do it in the time that you've been given to do it in. So check what your own reporting deadline could be by looking at what your year end is for the company that's doing business in the UK. And remember that that is a common sense elephant in the room, you know one when you see one test, okay? And secondly, having checked the deadlines, work out whether the law applies to you at all. I'm getting it a bit back to front, you may say, but it's easy to check the reporting deadline, and that ought to drive lots of cycles of corporate behaviour. It's not so easy always to establish whether you're caught by this, and that's a lot to do with what your corporate structure is. It's, of course, a lot to do with what your revenue is, or turnover in UK English. So have a look at the assessment tool that is available on our website. We spend a lot of time designing it so that it did not take you long to fill it in. And we have found the answers to be robust and clear and reliable so far. If you can break it, let us know. I'll buy you a bottle of champagne. Consider the extent of your compliance and the risk factors in terms of whether this highlights your brand and enhances it, or it's a question of getting stuff done that needs to be done in terms of housekeeping. But as much as anything, don't treat it as a one-off project. Remember that we have other laws around transparency and reporting in the UK, and a probability of more. So look at building in something that's pragmatic, workable, easy to understand and use, cost-effective, and isn't taking too much time. If you consider it's not enhancing your business and your brand offering, at least let's make it as pain-free and hassle-free as you can as you design your reporting systems. And so last, to help with pain-free and hassle-free preparation, slide 18 lists some further reading, our overview, and also the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, the TISC, and the Slavery Commissioner's annual report for last year, so that you can see what is out there for now. And those sites themselves contain some very good further links to offerings like Stronger Together, which helps the construction industry and the supermarket and food supply industry. There's a lot of material out there that can be researched online and from outside the UK, which means that you can get this information and move towards compliance. So thanks very much all for listening. On behalf of Roxane and Colin and the team here at Taylor Wessing, I wish you all a good evening, afternoon or morning, whichever it is where you are. And please come back to us if you have any further specific questions you'd like to raise. Thanks very much.